Shalom, Mr. Makovsky. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation. We're here today on 4th of June, Kav Dalet in ER, on Zoom. Where do I catch you and how do you prefer to be called?
Just call me David. I'm at the Washington Institute office in Washington.
Almost Jerusalem, huh?
I was in Jerusalem, so I'm a little confused, I guess.
Yerushalayim Shel Mata.
Yeah, that's right.
David Makovsky, graduate of Columbia and Harvard in Middle East Studies. Mr. Makovsky is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy Project on the Middle East Peace Process and Adjunct Professor at Johns Hopkins University.
That's right. It's now called the Coret Project for Arab-Israel Relations.
What is it?
The Coret Project, it focuses on a lot of issues related on Arab-Israel ties, whether it's the Abraham Accord countries, the Saudi issue, Israeli-Palestinian, it's U.S.-Israel, a lot. It's
complex game theory.
Yeah, it's tough.
Mr. Makovsky commentary has been broadcast on TV. His writing can be found in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. He published numerous books and more recently co-authored with Dennis Ross, Myth and Illusions in Peace. Sounds like the Middle East.
We did another more recent one called Be Strong and of Good Courage, kind of a portrait of 4 Israeli prime ministers and their historical decisions that they made.
In 2013-14, he worked in the office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy to Israeli-Palestinian Negotiations. But what impressed me most was listening to interviews he gave recently where his analysis of the situation struck me as centered, fact-based, and important. It's quite an impressive accomplishment. How did you get there, and how have you managed to survive in this game? It's not as simple for a Jewish Zionist to be in the corridors of power for long. Am I right to describe you as a Jewish Zionist?
That's correct. As an American, I care deeply, as America cares deeply about trying to bring Arabs and Israelis closer together. We need to be realistic in what we can achieve. But I think the American national interest very fits, the desire to try to bring people closer and to be very sober-minded about the real threats that are out there. Certainly Jewish history tells you when your enemies say they want to kill you, you got to take it seriously. And I think that's America's view too.
That's what a lot of Jews like to hear and some Jews don't like to hear. So we'll get there. Ordinarily, my interview program focuses on transmission of Jewish heritage. But in these critical times where the partisan coverage of the Middle East leaves us confused and worried, where every politician in general has something to say, and when Israel under threat and pressured from every direction, we need to evaluate the situation honestly. I'm sure that our audience will appreciate your expertise and experienced analysis. Mr. Makovsky, firstly, considering the fierce military and political campaign in which Israel finds itself, I need to ask you, are you worried? Where is the greater battle? Our military fighting with Hamas and possibly Hezbollah, our strategic struggle against Iran, or our international political struggle against becoming a pariah state?
You don't have the luxury to choose one of these issues. I mean, they're multiple. For the United States that sees Israel as its ally for decades, I think all of these are worrisome. And, Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, said Israel's got like 7 fronts. Now, you do have to prioritize. And certainly when after October 7th happened, there were some who wanted Israel to go dive into Lebanon. But yet Israel stayed focused on the south. Believing a war with Lebanon with Hezbollah is a greater order of magnitude, which it is. So it doesn't mean one issue will solve all the issues, although some people think we got a ceasefire in one place that lead to a ceasefire elsewhere, perhaps. But I think Israel was right to focus on Gaza. I think on the Iranian front, the issue of the nuclear issue has kind of been off the front pages these days, is given everything else going on. But I think what happened on April 13th and 14th is a remarkable example, a glimpse into the future of what the Middle East could be. I mean, look, give the Israeli military planners a lot of credit. For 25 years, they've been talking about the Arrow missile and the Arrow 2, and now the Arrow 3 that could literally hit a bullet with a bullet. That was a work of a lot of decades of work. Getting Israel into CENTCOM, Central Command of the United States military, was a huge deal. Now, everyone's looking at the same screen when Iran is firing ballistic missile, firing a cruise missile, firing drones. All the countries in the Middle East see it. And the fact that Britain and France and not to mention the United States, but also Jordan and some ways Saudi Arabia, all kind of were a part of this picture, is breathtaking. I mean, the news cycle is so fast, we don't even have a chance to digest, maybe in religious terms, to say the miracle of what happened in April. But, I don't know if this coalition is something that will last forever. It might depend on other factors. Is it a necessity or luxury? We don't know yet. But it clearly proved that it's not just a theory. It's a reality, and that Israel is able to work with these other countries against Iran. And if there is a breakthrough with Saudi Arabia and Israel, that could cement into an anti-Iranian alliance of sorts. So I don't know. There's so many different things that need to be digested. We're in the middle of the hurricane, so to speak. Hard to see out of it. But I think that prioritizing the Gaza front is the right approach. But, as Gallant said, there's a lot of different fronts, and clearly Hezbollah is a huge one. But the Iranian thing was an example of what happens when countries work together. And I think this is a product of decades of work. And now the CENTCOM, anti-air, coalition shows what is indeed possible.
So when I ask you, are you worried? Your first answer started with America. Are you speaking for yourself, or are you speaking as part of a think tank that sees itself as linked to an American position?
Look, we're not the government. We're not the Biden administration. I served in a Democratic administration, but I've had my criticisms of the administration at points. I think sometimes the administration has been better amplifying, they amplify misconduct, but they weren't amplifying the purpose of the war. There's the goals and there's the conduct, two separate things. And sometimes I felt that we'd hear a lot about the conduct, but we wouldn't hear about the goals.
Are you worried?
Yeah, I am. But I will say that I know I've tried to point this out forcefully to high levels in the administration, and I do feel that they were responsive. And if you look at Jake Sullivan's briefings, the National Security Advisor, he now talks much more about the goals of the war, which is to defeat Hamas. And I think that's important, because otherwise it doesn't contextualize anything. If you're just talking about conduct without talking about objectives, then why fight this whole thing?
You mentioned a coalition, and it sounds wonderful, but it looks like there are two realities. One is the official governmental coalition, and then there's I would love to say undercurrent, but it's an overcurrent of the population. We hear a lot of voices in every country from different organizations within the countries, in Europe, in the United States, from the State Department, that do not sound like they are part of a coalition. They are like the opposition. It looks like there's a coalition and there's an opposition. Which is the one running the show? I know that the ones that are running the military is the coalition, but we see from Biden and other people's shifting positions that it may be that the opposition is starting to gain the upper hand, certainly with Biden's concern about the election.
You're fair to point that out. It's legitimate. I mean, I think the White House, for the most part, people like Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk are the two top officials in the government who are dealing with this issue. And when you talk to the Israelis, they will say, look, these two guys are problem solvers. Israel likes working with them because they want to solve problems. There are times where Israel will hear a tone of moralizing from the State Department. The nature of the State Department is to be more trying to harmonize all sorts of conflicting bilateral relationships all over the Arab world. The Arab world itself is divided, where the governments want it both ways, so to speak. They want Israel to basically, eliminate Hamas, and yet they want it done by 6 a.m. without Al Jazeera camera present. It's not the real world. So, they talk about if Hamas wins and is emboldened, how terrible it is for them as the Arabs, but yet they don't do anything to condition the societal discourse in their countries. And they know they're not elected people. And when you're not elected, you tend to, people have an image, well, if you're not elected, you could be a dictator, do whatever you want. It doesn't work that way. In the Arab world, we have 51% in an election breaks a tie. There, they want 99% support. That will lead you to pandering to your public more often. So I think there's divisions inside the Arab world between the governments and the population. The governments understand very well how destructive Hamas is, how destabilizing it is, how a ring of fire of Iranian proxies is against them too. But they don't want to stick their necks out because they feel that's not popular in their countries.
You explained it in a very professional, detailed way, but at the end of the day, we are linked to the world and we are slowly becoming ostracized. And the world seems to get more and more united. We saw it from when the action on South Africa took place, Lahavdil. Slowly the wheels have moved, but once it reached a critical point, there is no way to move it back. And that's the fear that Israel is going to be really isolated. And the key word appears to solve all the problems is a phrase that Israelis are worried and the world wants it badly, which is two-state solution. The phrase two-state solution seems to solve all the problems at once. So I'm going to ask you specifically, normally we're suspicious of people giving Israeli advice. We like to listen to people who agree with us, but in this echo chamber, we get isolated from people who see reality as imperative. You're a passionate, committed Jew, but you're not an ideologist, I believe, which is why I find it important to hear your programmatic views. So moving from the immediate campaign, I want to pick your brain about this two-state solution. There seems to be a strong push for an expansion of the Abraham Accords, which many may give Israel a new place in the Middle East, the Middle East Alliance. But it comes with a strong price. Immediate implementation of some form of two-state solution, with several countries already recognizing Palestinian statehood, whatever form it may be is not clear, it has become an imperative situation. How do you see this grand tectonic shift, and how does Israel navigate this move and its danger?
Look, great questions. First of all, I think the Saudi entrance card is not as the way it was portrayed maybe back in February. I think instead of talking about a time-bound Palestinian state or irreversible steps, now the new phrase is credible steps. I think the Saudis want this deal for their own reasons. It's largely a byproduct, it should be said, not because they need this peace with Israel so badly. They want a defense treaty with the United States. A treaty requires 2/3 of the Senate. The U.S. hasn't had a defense treaty since Japan in 1960. The U.S. has changed since 1960. It's more polarized. To get 2/3, you've got to throw in sweeteners for the Senate that they can relate to. A normalization with Israel might put it over the top. So it is always been, it's a byproduct. It's not in and of itself the main reason. It all is done to serve the fear that, Iran could attack Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis say, we don't have NATO. If Russia attacks Germany, the U.S. goes to war for Germany. It's not true with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia could only be envious of what happened on April 14th.
Does it include nuclear technology, and the Senate may never pass this?
Well, I think it would be the U.S. would be operating it, but, you could say, but 20 years from now, couldn't the Saudis kick out the Americans who were technicians who were running it? So there's risk of civil technology. There's no question about that. Israel does not seem so concerned, at least the government doesn't. It sees normalization as the Super Bowl, the World Cup, the World Series may be all wrapped together. If you have peace with the most powerful, influential Arab country, like the Saudis, it changes Israel's standing in the region. I mean, it is amazing to get to your earlier point about what I see of like the parallel tracks that are going down this train is that on one hand, there's those who want to criminalize Israel, and there are those who want to normalize with Israel. Ironically, the normalizers are coming from the Arab world. I'm not saying the criminalizers aren't coming from the Arab world too, but I think Hamas, I can't prove it. I don't have coffee with Sinwar, but I think the fact that a Saudi-Israeli peace could happen for them is like game over. They become a footnote. And that's, I think, one of the reasons for October 7th.
I'm a little concerned when I hear this normalization. I remember during the Oslo times, they were talking about having yellow pages in Israel, Dapei Zahav, about Iraq and Syria to create businesses. There was this euphoria about the new Israel being incorporated in the Middle East, and it survived exactly 5 milliseconds. I know the situation is different. Palestinians are now not the center of the Arab-Israeli.
Exactly. Look at the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords is a case of not just a peace between governments, I think, but a peace between peoples. You've got, close to $3 billion in trade between Israel and the Emirates, and that doesn't even include a lot of the military-to-military stuff, which is not listed. It has taken off like a rocket. I mean, yes, it slowed down because of the war, and it slowed down, frankly, even a little bit under Netanyahu. But the point is that the Emiratis see peace with Israel as key for them. Because they think the oil at a certain point is going to run out, and they need to digitize their economies. And I think the Saudis also feel it. And they don't know the U.S. is going to be around in the Middle East because the U.S. might go off to Asia.
If everything is built on Iran, and we know that Iran is an unstable typhoon, first of all, if there is a political shift or change in Iran, if Iran in its Machiavellian strides try to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, things can change. $3 billion trade sounds good, but means nothing if all of a sudden these countries can see a new alliance with Iran, which has become the greatest force in the Middle East. So how do you put all of your eggs in one basket?
No, you never put all your eggs in one basket, but we also should be a bit humble in that the Sunni-Shia rivalry has gone on for, so many centuries. I don't see the Saudis and the Iranians being allies. Yes, they had an agreement to lower tensions. The U.S. had it with the Soviet Union, too. It didn't make them allies. They're called détente in those days. So I don't think all the security people in Israel you talk to think this is a strategic bonanza. This will help cement the Iran alliance. And look, I think a little bit April 13th and 14th taught us, you fire so many rockets at Israel and you have 7 fronts, you can't fight this alone. Having allies is essential. And I think it would be a brilliant move by Israel to reach out in the Gulf where there's common interests, because none of them like the Iranians. They don't want Al-Qaeda. They don't want ISIS. They don't want the Islamic Jihad. They don't want Hamas. So there's more convergences than divergences between the Saudis and Israel. I'm not saying anything is easy in the Middle East, but I think, as you said before, correctly, if you look at the verse in the Torah, Einam levadad yishkonu v'goyim lo yitchashav, that they're a nation that dwells alone and they're not counted among the nations. I saw a word of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs who said, this isn't a bracha, this isn't a blessing, this is a curse. That's not something you aspire to. You aspire to friendship. I think if you look at, King Solomon, I mean, the idea of alliances is something that is a good idea.
Back to this two-state solution question.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad let me go back to that. I wasn't trying to avoid that. Look, I think the Saudis have kind of lowered their demand a bit because they want this defense treaty. So they're not insisting on it immediately. I've been a believer in the principle of 2 states. However, I think if you use baseball as an analogy, we've tried to hit the home run 3 times: Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, and the Obama administration. And I was part of the third effort. I think these are noble efforts, but maybe we just have to hit some singles, because when you swing for the fences, you can strike out. And I think what was missing in 2000, I explained this on the PBS NewsHour, some other media interviews I do, is to say, look, if 2 states meant that the Palestinian state was, Costa Rica, I think almost every Israeli would sign up. But if the state is not Costa Rica, but is a mini Iran, nobody will sign up. So the character of that state is critical. And there needs to be an understanding about what is the character of the state. And without enforcement, it's worthless.
You're saying things that we all know, but now the mood is superficial. It's a one line that captured the imagination. Free Palestine, from the river to the sea, 2-state solution. People live in slogans, and it starts sounding like the leaders also living slogans, because that's the key to their perpetuating power.
It could be, but the more people understand the river to the sea is, genocidal, that means the end of Israel, people are going to have questioned that slogan and are pushing back. It'll take a little time, yes. But it doesn't mean that we should give in to these...
But how do we square the circle here? We under pressure, and time is ticking, the pressure to defeat Sinwar, the pressure to fight Hezbollah that Biden is not allowing us to do, the pressure to keep Iran in bay, the pressure from becoming a pariah state. All of these things are not abstractions. In Washington, there are headlines and there are conversations, but in Berlin, in Paris, in London, in the streets, these are fires that are burning. And how is Israel squaring this circle?
You're asking on so many levels. I mean, I'm hoping I can do justice to your question. It just seems to me on the substance of it. First, let me just focus on the substance. Then there's the marketing and how it plays out messaging-wise. But I always want to start with the substance. If you don't have an enforcement mechanism, like we saw in 2007, I was invited to speak to 800 students at Harvard Business School, along with the Princeton dean, a woman by the name of Amani Jamal, who's a religious Palestinian woman. I just said, look, I'm not living in the past, but all I can tell you is, in 2007, you had a small minority of Hamas people who outmaneuvered and outmuscled Palestinian Authority. And it wasn't just a moment in time. We're still living in the shadow of 2007 because Hamas took control and didn't relinquish control. So unless you have a mechanism, none of this matters. I'll give you another example. In Lebanon, 2006, Lebanon war, there was a whole Security Council resolution called 1701, which was supposed to keep Hezbollah from the border. And yet, Hezbollah outmaneuvered the Lebanese army and took control of the border. No one did anything to that. There was no enforcement. If you don't enforce diplomacy, if you don't give it teeth, someone's going to enforce it, then all this stuff is meaningless. And to me, a Palestinian state has to be done through clear benchmarks on security.
David, you're pitching to the choir. We agree on that. But the problem is that right now, the Palestinians know that this time is on their hand. All they have to do is say no. They have nothing that they care about. So another 13 people get killed here, another 30 people get killed there. They are playing their leverage. The leverage is pressure on Israel, and Israel cannot withstand it for long. So all they have to say is no. So how do we get the opening for a possible path to two-state solution? A path to two-state solution will require the Jordan Valley, will require forces in Bethlehem and Shechem, cooperation with Palestinian Authority, and not to mention who is going to be in Gaza. But just the idea of a two-state solution, how do you make this concept when you put those enforcement and they say no?
They can say no, but Israel's not going to commit suicide.
But then we are back to the square one, where we are perceived as the as the naysayers, and it doesn't matter why. So we are on this track. The whole reason for us to do it gets to make us the worm that eats under the rock, that eats the rock.
This is why it's very important that the U.S. and Israel are synchronized, because look, that was Zionism's strength. And as someone who's a student of Zionism, going back to Weitzman and when the Brits were like the superpower, the greatness of Zionism always was its ability to work on two tracks, to have an ethos of self-reliance, that no one is going to work for you if you don't work for yourself, and defend yourself by yourself, and at the same time cultivate alliances with the most important power. And Weitzman did that. Chaim Weitzman did that, before World War I, leading up to World War II. And Israel has tried to do that with greater success. By the way, we make it sound like these are the worst days. I mean, no one ever would have imagined the scope of the relationship. I mean, as someone who teaches this at Johns Hopkins, at graduate students, I mean, people don't realize that Israel wasn't even invited to the White House, the prime minister, until 1964, 16 years after the state was founded. The relationship has actually grown in breadth and depth. Has it had its hiccups, its problems? Yes. And I'm not here to sugarcoat anything. But I'm saying if you would have, I saw some clip of David Wolpe, and I thought he said it well. He said an imaginary conversation with his great-grandfather. And the grandfather, he was complaining to his great-grandfather, the U.S. is going to take some money off the $4 billion it gives Israel. He goes, what? There's an Israel? I didn't know there was an Israel. What? The U.S. is its biggest supporter. What? It gives $4 billion a year? So they take a little money here. I mean, Ben Gurion would have loved these kind of problems. He didn't have that relationship. I'm not here to sugarcoat. My point is, though, is sometimes there's no context to the moment we're in. And the moment we're in is that, there are certain tensions. But look, let me give you an example. And again, I'm not trying to avoid you. But if you look at Rafah, okay, for 3 months, the media was filled, the pundits, there's going to be thousands and thousands of people killed, and the U.S. and Israel are not going to survive it. What happened? Just the opposite. The U.S. and Israel worked together quietly, behind closed doors, and came up with a strategy, which is first go to the Philadelphia road, go to the Egyptian Gaza corridor where the tunnels are, plug up the tunnels, then work the peripheries, get close to 1 million people out of the city. Israel did exactly all that, and there's no real criticism. Yes, there was one mishap, and it's tragic and at this tent, but in the big picture, the U.S. and Israel relationship has proven more resilient than its critics have recognized. So you're never going to win over all the critics and all these European capitals. Accept everything you say. But the core is having the U.S.-Israel relationship as rock solid as possible.
Let's talk about this relationship. You mentioned Jack Sullivan and the White House, but we are all riled about Biden's pressure in Israel. And I understand that there is some lip service, but it appears that once again, it seems to be critical and more critical. And it's like almost at the critical point, or maybe it is the critical point. So obviously, the U.S. is not Israel, and it has its own interests. Sometimes it appears that they have Israel's interests in mind more than Israel's leadership themselves. But lately, we've seen Biden driven to end this war, both by being pressured from his left wing as well as the election campaign. Normally, it would be okay for Israel to help a friend in need, but it appears that the proposals are at Israel's expense, and they do nothing to eliminate Hamas control, let alone push it out of Gaza. We know that the State Department is not Israel's friend, but Blinken is Jewish, and we thought Biden is our friend. What is your opinion? What's going on there? I mean, you've been there at these negotiations behind the scene. How does it go? Please, this is the critical point, because if we can survive this, then we can gain another 2 months.
Look, I think that the hostage issue. I mean, there's one of the hostage families I'm in touch with almost on a daily basis now, and it's clearly the hostages don't have a lot of time. The administration and Israel have been working on this phase one approach of getting at least 33 out. 6 weeks of calm. Israel made a concession that the calm could go beyond 6 weeks if the negotiations continue. So far, I think the U.S. and Israel on that are very much in sync. I think the question, though, is the issue of withdrawal. And to me, it's not going to happen so soon. Because, look, in some ways, this is the second intifada. By 2002, Israel had already taken Palestinian cities. But it took another 2 to 4 years, frankly, even though people say the intifada was over in 2004. In some ways, it lasted until 2006. It took time because there are going to be small units that are going to survive. And I think after Rafah, Israel can announce the end of major operations, but smaller operations will continue. So it's like, so long as you focus on the immediate question, the immediate issue, the U.S. and Israel are very much in sync. But if you say that it should lead to a withdrawal, look, here's the contradiction that people in some of these capitals don't want to deal with. Yeah, would the Arabs say they want to come in and provide economic assistance? More saying yes than they used to. Fine. But the truth is, I don't believe there's one of them, not one, that would actually fight Hamas themselves. And if Israel isn't there, then Hamas reconstitutes. And this is the contradiction. The zero-sum game is that Israel wants a deal that ensures Hamas does not reconstitute, and Hamas wants a deal that ensures that they do. Now, you can't have it both ways.
That's what we call the end game.
Yeah. So if you're talking about phase one of the hostage release, everyone, I think there's basic agreement. First of all, people don't realize, and you might realize because you follow this closely, Israel's got a fraction of the number of troops in Gaza that it had in the fall. In the fall, there were 360,000 reservists. Not all of them were called up, but there were many in Gaza. Now you have relatively few. You'll have fewer after Rafah. And then it'll be about city to city, Jabalia here, Zaytun there. It's going to be smaller units. Now, is that a full withdrawal? No. Is it most are out? Yes, most are out. But Israel feels it has no luxury, you see, to say, oh yeah, I'll withdraw. Because then Hamas comes back in where they leave. But at the same time, it's going to look more, I know what I'm going to say to you does not sound inspiring to you. I'm saying it in advance. It's going to be like a cohabitation, like it is in the West Bank, between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. But I don't see, if you're going to count, the Emiratis are not going to fire on Hamas. The Egyptians are not going to fire on Hamas. If Israel isn't there, Hamas will be back. And that's hard to hear.
David, when I chose to speak to you, I thought I'm going to face somebody who's going to give me some hard choices, some hard truths. And I find that I'm speaking basically to myself. You're saying all the things that we like to hear, but the truth is that we may not have that luxury. I'll give you an example. We're talking about the end game, having some forces that are going to help police Gaza. And it was Jonathan Pollard, who I don't agree with his views at all, but he said something correct. He said, look, right now with Israelis military there, we have 3-4 soldiers dying every other day. He said, do you think that there are forces in the world that want to enter this poison? Like with US losing 180 soldiers in Lebanon in one day? I mean, who's going to come there? We are creating fantasy game. Nobody wants to come there. And Israel is not going to be able to withstand the pressure of the world for long. Unlike you, I don't see this game continuing with good relationship with the United States. I think that people talk about the storm, talk, and all of a sudden the storm is there. And I think that we're facing a very, very critical headwind that we will not have the luxury to withstand or become really the pariah state that loses relationship that we have worked for decades to build. I do not see the positive structure that you and probably the institutions you work with are so keen to paint. I want to hear some hard truths, and you're not giving it to me.
Okay, well, good. I mean, look, the PA has got to come back. And that's something a lot of Jews don't want to hear that. But I think the PA, for all of its flaws, and I should say I was just in Ramallah last week, I think it's much more preferable than Hamas. And I don't think any Arab country is going to send a significant amount of money or personnel to Gaza unless it is invited in by a legitimate Palestinian entity. And you could say, well, the West Bank isn't perfect. Look at Jenin and this and that. I agree with all that. But, there's perfect and there's Somalia.
We agree on that. Now,
But not the government. That's not the view of the prime minister. Prime minister.
the prime minister is another complex issue. Let's talk structure. Now, the PA was in Gaza and was taken down by Hamas in 2 milliseconds. The Gazans are, whether they like Hamas or they're afraid of Hamas, all there is, it reminds me of the totalitarian state. All you have to do is threaten, and then you have two soldiers who control 50,000 people, and the 50,000 people start collaborating. Hamas, even in its weakened state, inspires fear, and because of its sinister acts that are in the field, I don't see a Palestinian Authority in Gaza not becoming affected by Hamas and its supporters. Whether Sinwar lives or dies, it doesn't really matter. Obviously, we need Sinwar gone, otherwise it's Arafat all over again. But how does PA in Gaza not become another voice of Hamas?
No, okay, it's a fair question. I would say the following. The difference between 2007 and 2024 would be, one, Israel has really degraded Hamas's capabilities dramatically, that it's toppled from power. And that's A. B, I said Israel, I think, is going to have to be there, albeit in small units. It wasn't there in 2007, okay? So that's two. Three, you need a lot of the Arab money to come in a way that it didn't come in 2007. So there has to be layers and layers here that the PA could show some successes. I mean, people have to understand Hamas just brought complete destruction on their society. That's what this war shows. And again, I'm not proud of any destruction, but you're dealing with an enemy that has embedded itself into a civilian population.
Right.
So, look, the hard truth is that Israel does not, when I was just with Gallant, the defense minister, less than 2 weeks ago, and he says this publicly, so I'm not disclosing anything. He said, look, Israel cannot be the one to occupy them, but Israel can work with the international system where the money is and with the PA, like it does in the West Bank now. Again, it's not a theory, it's a reality. The difference is in Gaza, Israel wasn't there at all. And I think for a while, Israel's going to have to be there. There's all sorts of ideas, safe areas, humanitarian bubbles where the Israeli army's on the perimeter of a city, but the Palestinians run it. Fine, whatever.
It will only work if there's what we call a Marshall Plan. Do you see a massive Marshall Plan, not some pier coming from the ocean? And we're talking about not billions of dollars, but tens of billions of dollars, and actually visibly in the field. And how long will it take?
No, it's a great question. Look, I think there's differences among the Gulf states here. The Emiratis want to pour billions and billions in, but they want to be sure that the government that they're pouring the money into is not going to put the money in its pocket. You had a guy like Salam Fayyad who has a track record. He's now at Princeton. I should disclose he's a friend of mine. He wanted a very transparent, accountable government. The Emiratis are very focused on the issue of Palestinian reform. The Saudis, less so. The Saudis are mono-focused on Vision 2030, economic prosperity, and this U.S. defense treaty. And if it means normalization with Israel, that's fine. It's a different generation. They don't have the same hang-ups like their parents and their grandparents' generation. So there's differences among the Gulf. I think those are the two most important countries. I think you might be able to bring the Saudis along, but you need to show some competence, and it's not going to be easy. The U.S. is going to be in this too, and the Europeans. There's going to be layers here.
Like about 4 months ago, I sent some messages to the Prime Minister office and others. I said, you want Israel to get the sympathy of the world at a time. Now it's just to salvage whatever can be. Just use the word Marshall Plan. How do we focus, and you are in the position to affect that? Let's say the word Marshall Plan more often in whatever modern Middle East terms it may come. So it will become the real driving reality, because Marshall Plan means the end game, not who is governing. Marshall Plan means a new solution for the Gazans. Marshall Plan means Israel is now part of the solution, not part of the problem. I want to hear the word Marshall Plan more often, and I don't hear anything about it. We talk about end game as politics. The truth is, it's always about money. It's always about, you want to save 2 million Arab Gazans? Show me the money. Show me the solution for their lives, not what meeting, what Bibi spoke to Gallant and Gantz and Biden and another trip to.
Look, I agree with you in terms of messaging is good, but people have been around the Middle East too long. It's not just a bumper sticker. They need to know if they're giving billions of dollars, the money is going to help real people. It's not going into a Swiss bank account.
We agree.
And they have to know that. It's not a footnote. It's integral. And look, Marshall, when you think about the post-World War II era, what Germany had in post-World War II was Adenauer. They had somebody, or even the change in Japan, Hirohito as an emperor. They had people who basically embraced this new, more Western kind of outlook. That does make a difference. And these guys are not naive. They don't want to just say, I'll write a check. They want to know, if I'm writing a check, it goes to help a hospital, it goes to water desalination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They need to know that.
So make it as, here there are contracts, there's a building company, there is a salination company, they are ready to come. It's not money, it is construct. There is 40,000 units that are ready to be built in Jabalia.
What's going to happen, and I think maybe here's where you and I, people will see the convergence. It might be a Gaza Reconstruction Authority in the shorter term that is more international based, that the transparency, the accountability standards are higher. That maybe the PA will sign off on that Gaza Reconstruction Authority, and they will deliver. Look, if Egyptian has great, they do a lot of construction, it'd be good for the Egyptian economy too, to pour money into helping.
Especially since they lost money from the tunnels being plugged.
Right. They did get rid of most of them, but they didn't get rid of all of them, and a lot of it is cross-border tribes on different sides of Rafah, on different sides of the border, whatever. I don't think Sisi is pro-Hamas. Sisi has done more.
But his son is pro-money, and his son is involved in that.
That's a question. My point is that I think it'll probably need to be more international in the beginning so it could produce results. I think the Gulf states would know if it actually helps people like hospitals, desalination, roads, highway, all the good stuff, clinics, they'll give more. Been around the block too many times to just feel if I write a check, it's solved. They know they won't. So they need to know who they're giving it to.
I'm not part of your think tank, but it's my last chance to have some kind of a say. Maybe instead of having a political end game, let's have an economical end game and have this economical end game be the headline all the time. Like instead of the pier is going to be built in June, have the construction authority is ready to start building in Jabalia.
100%.
You promise to deliver this line?
Look, I believe in myself. I'm having some meetings later this week based on my...
You can take credit for that.
Let's put it this way, we think similarly in that economics, I think if people will see they have a better future, Hamas has given them just misery. You have to beat something with nothing. And this, unfortunately, where I fear on the Israel side, the prime minister, if people think the choice is Hamas or Somalia, they go for Hamas. You can't beat something with nothing. You have to have something compelling that's a better vision for people. And I think the economics is crucial.
Let's move a step back. You spoke in the past about two legitimate national movements, Israel Zionism and Palestinian claim for their land.
Yeah.
Do you see a moral equivalence, or is there a true factual past that is important in informing out the present debate? Do facts matter? Does the past matter anymore? I'm talking about having a real Palestinian entity and not just a convenient construct with which to prosecute Israel. Is it relevant that Jerusalem and Israel are only place for the Jews while Arabs have 49 states or countries to live in? Are these facts really important a century after the fact, or they are not longer relevant?
Well, these are good questions. I mean, there's like 21 Arab states, 56 Muslim states. But hey, look, what I said to you before is what, I wrote a piece on this, I think you can see in the Times of Israel. I said, without enforcement, talk of a Palestinian state is hollow. That was my headline. I believe it. And that is, if you can't enforce stability, then, if you didn't like to see the book in Gaza, you won't want to see the movie in the West Bank. I mean, it's clear that unless there's an enforced stability, then forget it. It just won't work.
I'm asking you about the national movements and their relevant past. Right now, we have a national movement, but is it important to remember that at the turn of the century were barely any so-called Palestinians? They didn't have a name Palestinian. Is it important to remember that the Nakba was originally constituted by the Arabs themselves as being Nakba, meaning that how the Arab states betrayed the Palestinians? These are facts, but are they important anymore?
My point is, look, here's where I hope you and I agree, is that, I want dignity for both sides. But I feel with rights comes responsibilities. You have to earn it. And, if your track record isn't good because of what happened in 2007, then I think that you were outmuscled by Hamas. I think you have to prove Israel shouldn't have to take the risk. There's risk. There's calculated risk. There's reckless risk. They're not the same. And I think a calculated risk is by having here are the security benchmarks on the way to a state. That I think you could do. And I think people would understand that. Look, I don't want to make it sound that the past is destiny. If you think of Egypt, for example, they fought wars with Israel 48, 56, 67, 73. And yet, they made peace the first state. Begin did it with Sadat. And Israel has not had to fight a war with Egypt in 50 years. That's not a small thing. How many Israelis have died in 1970-73 war? Like 2,600 people. So if you would have said, well, look, they started a war. So if you look at the past proves that you can't trust them or whatever.
The difference is there's a great saying that states have to win wars. Terror organizations just have not to lose them. They win by not losing them.
Respectfully, on that point, if you look at 73, yes, Sadat crossed the canal. But the war ended with Israel outside of Cairo, encircling the Third Army, and also outside of Damascus. So they didn't win the war.
No, I'm saying that my point is that a terror organization such as Hamas can survive as long as there's one person alive, and they can say...
I thought of that. Believe me, I think of that every day.
Anyway.
I think of the Sinwar analogy that he'll come out of a hole somewhere. But to me, the question is, can he reconstitute himself or not? And that, to me, is why the issue of withdrawal is not going to be immediate. But I think the number of troops Israel will need is dropped. I think you could greatly improve the Gaza economy. You could give moderates a chance. They don't have a chance. They've been held hostage, too, by Hamas. Yeah. There hasn't been an election there since 2006.
You're talking to the choir, preaching to the choir here. But, as long as Sinwar is alive, Arafat will be nothing compared to what he's going to become. So he's going to become an impediment to any conversation whatsoever.
I would say one last point on this. There is a difference. What Hamas has been is basically an army. They've had 40,000 soldiers. They have hundreds of miles of tunnels. They have missiles. They've got, they have industrial-sized manufacturing of weaponry that they were able to create. Now it'll be a terror group. It won't be an army. And I think for the Israeli army, they would rather fight a much more diminished force. It doesn't mean that they don't exist, and it doesn't mean they won't claim victory, but Israel has to be sure that they don't reconstitute themselves, because if they reconstitute, I think there's no hope for two states. I said this on the PBS NewsHour. I said some people think that there's violence because there's not two states, and I think there's no two states because there was violence. At the time I was in the government, Hamas was too strong. They basically had a veto over what was done. So, I think anybody who wants two states, that does not work with Hamas. That's not what they're about. They're about the opposite.
We see now that any attempt by Hamas to have an agreement is being torpedoed by one man, Sinwar. Sinwar doesn't need to have tunnels and weapons anymore or 40,000 troops. He's become a symbol, like Arafat has become a symbol. And this symbol is going to become the most destructive force because nobody is going to have the guts to sign any paper for as long as Sinwar disagrees. And he's genocidal, suicidal. So we have to take him down.
I would just add one thing. Just remember, it took the United States 10 years until it caught Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden used to say, "You, America, you have the watches, but we have the time." In the end, he did not have the time or the watches.
But he was not a force anymore. He was just a person hiding in caves.
But he was a source of inspiration for many of the Al-Qaeda people.
Let me ask you the most important question that I think is, how do we confront Iran? Chopping down the Hydra's head, can we convince the US to join Israel in attacking Iran's nuclear facilities? I see Iran not only as a Middle East actor. Iran has become basically joined with Russia, China, North Korea to be really borrowing from Bush's line, the new axis, the more powerful axis of evil. And, without hitting the Hydra's head, I mean, it's a whack-a-mole, game. How do we convince US to do this? And more importantly, what is this obsession that the Biden post-Obama have to do with appeasing Iran and the going back? Now it's defunct, the nuclear agreement. It feels like they have something, like the Russians have something on Trump. It looks like Iran has something on Obama, Biden.
To be fair, I was not a fan of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal of 2015. But I will admit, before Trump left it, they were producing virtually no uranium. They actually kept to the core part of the deal. And when the U.S. pulled out, then they said, okay, we'll do it. We'll go all the way. I am worried that they will have enough for 10 bombs at 60% enrichment. 60% doesn't sound like a lot, but it's only 10, 12 days, according to the U.S. I think Colin Cowell, who's a top Pentagon guy, said in a hearing, to go from 60 to 90% purity, that's what you need for a bomb. Of course, you need to build a casing and build the actual bomb itself. We don't know what the weapon.
How do we get the U.S. to join and bomb this and basically save the Middle East, destroy this part of this axis of evil link that is affecting the West, and maybe topple this regime? I never saw how one act can have so many positive impacts.
Yeah, no, I understand. Look, my feeling is not about, Jews convincing the U.S. The U.S., for us as Americans, this is a core national interest, in my view, that they don't get a nuclear bomb. It'll change the Middle East, incredibly if they do it. And, the president has said that it will not happen on my watch. He's also said superpowers don't bluff. He says that.
We saw Obama's red line, so we remember.
I know, but to me, a key moment might come, if he wins or loses after November. There's a twilight zone between the election and the inauguration where politics is not at the center. And I think the president should be reminded of this and that, there's no good options here. There's no diplomatic option here that's going to work.
Can Israel survive till then? I'm not talking about the state. I'm talking about this barrage of attacks, political, and maybe we've seen just the beginning of declaring statehood for the Palestinians by 3, now 4 countries, blocking Israelis from arriving to some places, countries cutting diplomatic relationship. This sounds small, but it may be a beginning of irreversible.
But you know this as good as I do. In 1988, the Palestinians declared independence. I think it had 100 countries. It didn't change anything on the ground. I'm not here to sound blasé and complacent, but the main thing is the U.S.-Israel relations have to remain strong. If it isn't, that is huge because that impacts vetoes at the Security Council and things like that. Then it's a different world. I'd rather have, the Maldives, do what they do, then this is the big stuff. And there needs to be a convergence of interest between the U.S. and Israel on core points. I think Rafah was a case where they worked together, but the media doesn't like to talk about where they work together. 3 months, all we heard was that the U.S. and Israel will, have this massive collision over Rafah. And it didn't happen.
Do you think that what's happening in Rafah is really a cooperation between American and Israeli?
100%. I have no doubt about that. That doesn't mean that Israel's done everything the U.S. asked. If you say you move 1 million people to the Muasi, the northern part of Muasi, or to the Nusayrat center part of Gaza, the question is, how are the facilities there, and how is the facilities there? I mean, there are issues. I'm not here to say everything is a honeymoon, but I'm saying that whatever they say in the media, whatever the pundits predicted, collision, an Armageddon between the U.S. and Israel, guess what? Israel and the U.S. worked it out. 1 million people found their way out of Rafah without being hurt. Israel worked the perimeters, took the Philadelphia road, which is the strategically most important thing because it prevents resupply. It did it. And it's created a perimeter almost all around Rafah. And to me, and pretty soon, they're the end of major operations. It doesn't mean, like I said, I think on the low level, the stuff's going to go on and on like an attrition. But the U.S. and Israel work beautifully together, but the media doesn't focus on that point.
You mentioned working out singles instead of home run. Did you take it from Kissinger?
I took it from being a baseball fan. No, but I love it. I mean, look, I teach Kissinger a lot.
Kissinger is, his singles both about China and the Middle East and Russia. But he could have gotten it wrong, and the whole thing would topple. Did you ever get anything?
No, but of course, look, Martin Indyk, who I work with, he wrote this book on Kissinger that I would urge you to read, called The Master of the Game, about Kissinger. And he has a final chapter in the book that I really would urge you to read. As someone who thought everything had to be transformative, he said, I've come around to Kissinger's thinking of being more of an incrementalist. So, of course, I use the metaphor of singles, doubles, because I love baseball. But the incrementalism is the right approach when there's not a convergence on the big things. But look, if you would have said, the peace treaty with Egypt that started in 1979 would still be here in 2024, and there would be no wars. And the peace with Jordan would still be here, despite all the problems. I don't know if people would have believed it, or that even the Palestinian Authority and Israel would work together.
We agree on Kissinger. We don't agree on the more modern history, which you actually were part of. Oslo, for instance. Did you ever get it wrong? Did you say, oh my God, I really messed this one up? I don't say that you authored it, but you were part of the fan club, and this disengagement, Oslo. I happen to think that disengagement still played for us because it bought us time and the ability to say, look, what if? But Oslo was ultimately a disaster because the Palestinians are hostages. They're proxies to other forces, and they've been that for a century. Since the Ottomans, since the owners of the land, if you read, you realize that they've never really played their own game. They never really were there for their own interests. Maybe if they're isolated, they will. And I always believe that there'll be a moment of some calamity where Israelis and Palestinians will find that they are the closest allies that they can be for each other. But until then, I drive in Jerusalem, I take a taxi as you have, and there's an Arab driver because they drive most of the taxis, and you speak to them, and what do they say? All of us want peace. There are some Majnoons there that, the Shabab, but the truth is, when push comes to shove, they vote for them. They're the ones who, have you gotten it wrong?
Look, first of all, we always have to be humble, okay? And I said without enforcement, this state idea is not going to work. I still think incrementalism is the only way. Oslo was built on incrementalism. It was a belief that you could not solve all the problems at once. The gaps were just too big. But on the other hand, if you say the gaps are big, therefore do nothing, in my view, what you're talking about at the ICC and the ICJ and all this, I think, and what Mr. Smotrich is, I'm not saying you agree with Smotrich, but
No,
the idea of annexing these places
it's crazy.
would make Israel a pariah. And I'm thinking, if you don't pick apart the PA from Hamas, you'll be left with Hamas. And I don't think Israel's in a better place vis-a-vis Iran. I am worried. I'm telling you, you want me to hear tough truths? I am very worried that Mr. Smotrich wants his next move is to try to dismantle the PA. And I feel that's playing into Iran's hands. It creates a vacuum that will be filled by Hamas and will be filled by the worst people. I mean, the worst.
The PA just stood today and condemned Iran.
Yeah.
Hamas did it today,
That was I tweeted that out, and I hope people who follow the social media at David Makovsky will follow me. But
how do we follow you?
My name at David Makovsky, one word, capital D, capital M.
This is for Twitter, but is there any other platforms?
I think Instagram. I don't know how to use it, but my research assistant helps me. But so I try to republish everything.
David, I really am honored to speak to you. I figured if I end it on my terms, I can have a couple of more minutes.
Okay.
Tell us, where did you grow up? Where's your background?
St. Louis, Missouri. I was really, I went to a day school. But I was really inspired when Sadat came to Jerusalem. I thought, here's a case of where people can change history. And if he succeeds, I knew enough at the age of 17 to know that Egypt was the strongest Arab country. And if they get out of the war coalition, you don't have the interstate wars. And thank God now that since 1979, since the treaty and Sadat's visit in 77, there's been no interstate wars. Of course, there's terrorist groups, there's Hezbollah, and there's Hamas, and there's Iran, and I mean, they're a country. Look, at least Hamas and Hezbollah don't have an air force. They don't have tanks in the same way of a country. All the trappings of a state, but they don't play by the rules of a state. They take hostages. They don't wear uniforms. They hide behind civilians. They hide in the urban areas. And look, I keep saying this when I go to college campuses. I've visited 190 college campuses. That's a lot of visits. And I say, don't forget, every other conflict where there's an urban war, they take the civilians, they move them like to Turkey and to Lebanon and Jordan. Okay, that's what we saw with Mosul, we saw with Raqqa. This is the one conflict where you're not allowed to move people because they think it's a conspiracy of Israel to want to export the Palestinian issue to Egypt. So the net effect is they're stuck in a narrow area. So of course there's going to be more casualties. And of course it is when the people are embedding themselves in civilian areas. So don't forget how anomalous this conflict is. This is not normal. This is a terror group that tries to use to its advantage that the rules of war are no rules at all.
Tell me, David, if people want to listen to non-ideological Zionist people like you, Yossi Klein Levy, Brett Stevens, who else besides Farik Zakar,
Yeah.
Who else can we listen to who is not going to play to either the echo chamber or the Smotrich angle or Jonathan Pollard who thinks we need to annex Gaza and all this crazy?
I'll give you a few more names. Dennis Ross, my colleague, we've written books together, and Rob Saloff. Just go to the WashingtonInstitute.org. I think you'll see a lot of people like that. I think in Israel you've got, like as you said, Yossi Klein Halev is excellent. Micha Goodman is coming out with a book. We're going to be hosting him here. Is very good. Tal Becker, who's now is finishing at the foreign ministry, and I don't want to announce anything before it's official, but he's going to be in a place of a
He's the biggest legal mind, Israeli legal mind of our generation, I think. And Micha Goodman is a great Jewish scholar, but what is he doing about politics in the Middle East?
He is. No, he's involved. I would read him, read Yossi. I mean, you've got a few people out there, and there's others too. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like I'm just limiting it to a few people, but start with the Washington Institute people, I hope, and you'll see others as well. And
how do we invite you to attend some kind of gathering where you can explain your position.
You can write me, and we'll see if we can work it out.
I'm honored. I'm sorry if I press too many buttons.
It's okay. It's fine.
I like a debate. I don't want to be part of the echo chamber here.
I like it too, and don't shortchange the resilience of the U.S.-Israel relationship.
No.
And I really feel that it's the most central relationship. Next to the IDF itself, for the state of Israel, there's no more important relationship. And the American national interest, yes, it's not identical with Israel. No two countries are identical, but it's the closest Israel will ever have with any country. And Israel doesn't have the luxury to give up on the United States, and I don't think the United States has the luxury to give up on the state of Israel.
As we said, Be'ezrat Hashem, thank you so much, and Am Yisrael Chai.
Amen.
Thank you, David. Have a good, successful week.
Thank you. All the best to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.